Hi everyone, welcome to our next lecture on Gordon Allport's Humanistic Psychology, the Individual and His Religion. And we're now going to look at Chapter 5. This is the penultimate chapter to the book, and in our next lecture we'll be wrapping this book up. Chapter 5 is devoted to doubt. In this chapter, Allport describes seven styles of doubting in religious belief. He covers everything from the nature of doubt, what doubt is all about, how doubt is seemingly embedded in contemporary culture, Western culture, and how doubt is through skepticism, and in its extreme form, cynicism is a remnant or a quality, a characteristic of Enlightenment thinking. So the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period from the 1600s to through the 20th century. So he will discuss a little bit what he means by doubt, and also then look at the seven styles that he outlines of people who doubt religious belief. Those seven are doubts primarily reactive and negativistic, doubts associated with violations of self-interest, the shortcomings of organized religion, God in man's image, doubts associated with the genesis of the religious quest, scientific doubt, and finally, referential doubting. So let's start with his ideas about doubt. He opens the chapter up with this paragraph. The primary theme in the history of the world, Goethe has said, is the conflict between belief and unbelief. In certain epochs, faith in some form reigns supreme. In others, doubt gains the upper hand. Our own age, we know, is a period of doubt and negation. So this is, he's opening up the dialogue, the chapter on doubt, by saying that our very age, our epoch, and he's talking about post-Enlightenment psychology, thought, the intellectual Western, secular, humanistic Western thought, he's saying is marked by doubt. Now, I'd like to point out that doubt is a questioning. You come to university to learn how to question. That's what you do. For 4 years, you question. Hopefully. There are some instances where the question itself can be questioned. I think today in our postmodern culture, we have a tendency in the university for certain things to be questioned and for it to be taboo to question other things. The questioning is one of those taboos. There are certain movements that are temporarily in vogue, fashionable to embrace, and it seems like the embracing of certain topics could be more open-minded, more intellectual, more akin to the university setting. But I think it's important that we continue to question even those seemingly open-minded ideas. So Allport then continues, he says, the psychological fact of the matter is that the conflict between belief and disbelief is common enough condition of mind in any epoch. So he's saying this really isn't something that's unique to our age. It's always been a part of the history. The schism between belief and questioning of belief. He says, I wish to point out that only that belief is the assent or affirmation that we feel respecting the existence of the object of sentiment. Positive sentiments of any sort inevitably entail some grade of belief, and such belief always has motor concomitants. For what we believe, we tend to act on. Negative sentiments, likewise, usually involve a belief in the existence of their rejected objects. Although there are exceptions to this rule, as in the case of the atheist who both disbelieves in the deity and rejects the concept. So what we're finding here is that we can have more or less sophisticated forms of disbelief. And he wants to draw our attention to the fact that it's our responsibility intellectually. Maybe if you're reading this as from a spiritual perspective, it may even be a certain responsibility spiritually to remain aware of the nature of your cynicism or of your skepticism. Skepticism is maybe a form of questioning. It's a suspension of belief. You're skeptical. That means that you don't come to a conclusion. You just remain uncommitted to what's being proposed. Cynicism is something that has a negation built into it. You, before even considering it, you've dismissed it. One who's cynical. Imagine it being a guarded. This is like being intellectually guarded. So imagine when you're out at the supermarket or at the store or maybe out socializing, you're at a coffee house and you meet someone new. Healthful cautiousness might be skeptical. Someone approaches you and you might be friendly but yet remain aware that you don't know this person and what their motives are. Whereas cynicism would be assuming that the person is always after something of their own interest. You smile at someone or someone smiles at you, and you can take that either as a nice gesture. The skeptic would smile and accept the gesture, but keep in mind that there's a potential that it could be manipulative. The cynic just assumes that the person is after something other than friendliness or kindness. So it's important to keep these in mind when we're thinking about belief and disbelief and doubt. Allport continues, besides the belief that is associated with sentiments, there is also a kind of primitive credulity about things, most evident in the young child who believes almost anything he is told. Having learned to trust the first words he hears, to him all words that he understands are, for a while at least, as good as facts. Were he to hear that the moon is made of cheese, that God is a bear or a bearded man, he would temporarily satisfied and believe what he is told. So credulity is the willingness to believe. And what Allport's telling us is that in early childhood, the credulity, the willingness to believe, is the default setting. The young child is open to belief. And slowly, through experiences, through social experiences, through learning, the aligning between what one is told and what one experiences becomes either reinforced or challenged. And that is the origins of the disbelief. So Allport's telling us here that credulity, or the willingness to believe, is the earliest default setting for all of us as children, and we slowly come to doubt as a secondary process. The child's mind is thus furnished with many special beliefs before he discovers the important truth that words and facts are not identical. Among adults, the same tendency to verbal realism is met, though in a reduced degree and only in regions where experience is limited, or where the prestige of the speaker arouses almost hypnotic defense. Verbal realism, we may say, is effective whenever interest is attended by only slight appearance or by marked suggestibility towards the speaker. These conditions are especially marked in childhood, so much that we may conclude that belief based on primitive credulity is prior to disbelief or doubt. So he's saying that not only do these aspects exist in young children, this willingness to believe, but it also exists in some adults. And especially if they put a certain, they hold the speaker, the one who's speaking or writing, if they hold that person in high regards, with there's a certain willingness to believe. Think about when we study hypnosis. There are some of the factors in the 24% of the population that is hypnotizable. Some of the characteristics, the qualities are a willingness to believe and give control to another, and maybe as important, if not more important, is the individual's belief in the hypnotist. Do they hold them in high regards? This is same is true for the white lab coat wearing psychiatrist, or the person with letters before or after their name, father, doctor, MD, Ph.D, officer, sergeant. These all are words that are charged, labels that are charged, that change our relationship to the person and maybe open us up to suspend our disbelief. If you've ever heard of a con man, not to be sexist, you can also have a con woman. Con is confidence, so a confidence man. This is someone who knows how to gain your confidence and then manipulate you. That's where con comes from, the con. And in this way, these labels, these symbols of power, the uniforms, give a certain confidence in the individual. In my experience as a professor, there are many symbols of confidence that one associates with the profession. Earlier in my career, I would always wear a sports coat, a blazer, and an Oxford shirt, nice shoes and trousers, occasionally a suit. And there was a certain, I was younger, there was a certain, I had fewer years as a professor under my belt, and there was a certain reaction that uniform elicited from my classes. As years went on, I began to, teaching in warmer weather in the summers, wear more casual clothing that I would just wear every day. And in the cooler weather, I'd go back to my blazers, more practical approach to dressing rather than the uniform of the academic. So nowadays, I dress according to weather. If it's cold out, I'll wear trousers and a blazer and a long sleeve collared shirt, simply because it's warmer. And in the warmer weather, summer and spring, I tend to wear looser fitting, cooler clothes that haven't traditionally been associated with a college professor. And it's fascinating at the interaction that students have based on the uniform of the professor. Think about the professors you have had. How does their presence, the French would say presence, their presence, their presentation, their dress style, body language, speech, eye contact, facial expressions, all these things. How do they communicate confidence, not in themselves, but confidence in you towards them? And how does that affect your willingness to believe or doubt? Likewise, the titles that they hold. Do you find yourself having more confidence, fewer doubts in your instructors and professors who may have master's degrees rather than Ph.D.s? How does this affect your confidence and your credulity, your doubt, your skepticism, or possibly even your cynicism? So think of all these things these are all the things that Allport is discussing in this chapter. He says nearly every moment of waking life seems to entail the trying out of various alternative potential beliefs. Is it going to rain this afternoon? Shall I trust this real estate agent or that? It has been rightly said that thinking is largely a matter of vicarious trial and error. That is to say, of successive doubts and affirmations. All through our day, Allport says, we're constantly challenging beliefs in our minds. We might not verbalize them, we might not tell people about them, we might even forget that we're doing it. But if we become aware and analyze what we're thinking, or the cognitions and feelings that are taking place, Allport says it's a succession throughout the day of weighing up, comparing expectations versus outcomes in our lives, what we anticipate happening and what actually happens. And through this, we understand the basis of credulity or doubt, willingness to believe versus suspension of belief, disbelief. He goes on, we have a ready enough acceptance of what we call facts and a high degree of social agreement concerning them, for the simple reason that we define a fact as that which is verifiable by commonly acceptable tests. But facts, thus defined, are specific objects or happenings. What we come to explain them or to evaluate them or tell their larger significance, our paths of interpretation diverge. Facts never speak for themselves. Every biological fact, for example, can be fitted into at least two broadly inclusive hypotheses, a mechanistic or a vitalistic. In psychology, there are many schools of thought distinguished by their characteristic preference for one or the other style of interpreting the facts that are common to all schools. What a quote. To really think about what's going on in this passage, one must realize that in psychology we have the tendency to desire to want to treat this as a unified consensus in our field. But in fact, we have many different subcategories, many different schools of thought of psychology. For example, we often speak of 7 schools of thought in psychology. We'd have biological psychology, which focuses on genetics, the nervous system, and the endocrine system. We have cognitive psychology, which focuses on how one thinks in decision-making processes. We have behaviorism, which looks at operant conditioning, reward and punishment schedules and behavior, as well as classical conditioning or associative learning. And later in neo-behaviorism, we have social cognitive learning, so observational learning, watching others, learning through watching others. We have evolutionary psychology, which focuses on survivability in a given environment, as well as sexual reproduction, passing on the genes. We have psychoanalysis, psychodynamic psychology, which to a greater or lesser extent focuses on unconscious motivations and drives. We have existential phenomenological, also known as humanistic psychology, which is what Allport is a part of, that focuses on coming into contact with the four big issues of life: mortality, death, free will versus determinism, freedom to choose, make decisions, rather than be genetically defined or determined or environmentally determined. Responsibility in that free choice, ethics, morality, and finally, the big one, purpose, finding or creating a purpose in one's life. And finally, we have the social cultural approaches to psychology, which looks at cultural and societal influences. These are very different varieties of psychology. If we explore religion, which we're doing through all of these different lenses, we'll have seven completely different approaches and seven completely different pictures of the human religious experience. So in our tendency to think of psychology as a unified field, we go astray. And Allport tells us we have to keep in mind that there are some aspects of some schools of thought, such as humanism itself, that is going to come to to conclusions closer to that would be arrived at through the religious experience, simply to a pre-established relationship with the material. In other words, the answer you get is largely determined by the question you ask. And the the biological psychologist, also could be a neuroscientist, is asking questions, making assumptions that will determine what answers are possible. So let's conclude this little introductory remark by looking at, Allport sums this up by saying, although each individual has his own history, pattern, and degree of misgiving, there are certain modes of doubt that seem especially common. The modes that I shall distinguish are, I think, those most often encountered. It goes without saying that any single individual may entertain several of these styles of doubting. So these are his 7 styles of doubting, where doubting of religion comes from. To keep this in perspective, in a final chapter, he talks about the nature of faith. So now we're going to take a look at and examine doubting in religion. The first one, he talks about doubts, primarily reactive and negativistic. He opens up this paragraph by saying, first, the ardor that lies behind militant atheism needs to be examined. You've met militant atheists, individuals who may not only be atheists, but today we'd say anti-theists. Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. These are all examples of individuals who are anti-theists. They're not only atheists, they go out of their way to directly confront and encourage people to be against religion. It was said of one zealous apostle of free thought that he believed in no God and worshipped him. Of another that he would believe anything so long as it was not in the Bible. Such acute negativism is emotionally overdetermined. So this is a really common occurrence today. You may in class find professors or classmates. You'll find books, as I had mentioned, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, these are all, Steven Pinker, these are all individuals today who would be reactive and negativistic towards religious belief. There's no room for it and feel that it should be outright rejected. Well, there's a term, emotionally overdetermined. Sometimes I'll encounter in conversations or in students in class, we'll be discussing something in the lecture. Maybe you've had this happen in your classmates, or maybe you've experienced it and now you'll understand what has happened. And you'll become very impassioned, very fired up, very emotional about what you're talking about, and you might burst out or raise your hand and start really talking about how this upset you and that upset you, and this is what you believe and this is what you don't believe, etc., regarding a topic in psychology. That would be an example of your thinking being emotionally overdetermined. In other words, although in some scientific thinking and a lot of Enlightenment thinking you're supposed to distance yourself from your emotions, I don't think that's wise. That could be emotionally underdetermined. If you're only going about things rationally, intellectually, we're going to learn about that kind of a doubt. To discard emotions is dangerous business. Think about an argument with your lover, and they say to you, let's stick to the facts, not with what you're feeling. You're dismissing a big part of the human experience if you're dismissing emotions. However, if you're only focusing on emotions, such as the student who emotionally reacts to something in class, that would be emotionally overdetermined. So the thing here to understand about this is he's saying that this kind of doubt has an emotionally overdetermined basis. It goes beyond logic, it goes beyond reason, and is based on something more deeply emotional. There is a psychological concept for this that exists in this kind of doubting. It's the individual who reacts vehemently against something that is actually very important to them. It's almost like an overcompensation or an overreaction against something. We call it, in psychodynamic terms, reaction formation. The individual who reacts overly emotionally towards something like the belief in God or religion is having such a deep emotional reaction that we have to wonder what the impetus and the motivation for their doubt is. Sometimes in reaction formation, we find someone who would be vehemently outspoken against smoking. And then we discover they smoke secretly. Or someone who is very outspoken about pornography. And then we find that they have some sort of pornography collection. That's reaction formation. And it's marked by a deeply emotional response to the thing. Now, keeping this in mind, how do we understand religious belief? An individual who has a deeply emotional religious belief could be having a reactive doubt to the religion. The individual, Richard Dawkins, who has been famous for his vehement anti-theistic viewpoints, tirades, books. He wrote a very famous book called The Selfish Gene. He's an evolutionary biologist, evolutionary psychologist, and he's also become regarded as almost an evangelical or fanatical scientist. So that's an example. If you ever watch South Park, he's often lambasted on South Park episodes from a few years ago called Go God Go 1 and 2 are worth watching to see popular media depictions of Richard Dawkins. Allport goes on to say, in other cases, if reactivity, the unconscious mental life, seems decisive, if, as Freud has said, the religious sentiment is at bottom an extension of one's attitude towards one's physical father, then we must expect repressed animosity towards this father on occasion to be reflected in the hatred of religion. It seems curious that while Freud insists that belief in God is a projection of dependence and love associated with the earthly father, he overlooks the fact that by the same token, atheism may be construed as the projection of ambivalence or hatred associated with the male parent. Probably the truest statement would be that on occasion, probably not often, both belief and doubt may reflect unconsciously one's attitudes towards one's parent. Allport's very wise here. Unlike Freud, he's saying, okay, we could have some deep emotional connection between our parental figure, our father figure, and our spiritual heavenly father. And that could be based on an admiration for our physical father or a rejection of our physical father, parent. However, to make the statement that all religion boils down to this is reckless. And as he says here, here's what we should go to. On occasion, belief and doubt may reflect one's unconscious relationship with their parents. And I think that's a really reasonable and intelligent statement to make. We're going to learn more about Freud and psychodynamic theory. Let's move now to number 2, doubts associated with violations of self-interest. Allport says, the child who finds his personal advantage not immediately and satisfactorily served by his prayers may discard his conceptions and terminate once and for all his religious quest. Sometimes the issues come to a head later in life. So in other words, this doubt that enters in because one's prayers aren't answered. It's a very egocentric or egomorphic kind of doubt. It's one who found that in childhood their expectations of the fulfillments through prayer or through relationship with God didn't manifest, so now they doubt. So it's a second type of doubt. It's very common, but it's obviously less sophisticated than the first form of doubt, the reaction formation. Negativistic, reactivistic, over emotional reaction is much more interesting than this kind of simplistic, you lose belief because the egocentric prayers weren't answered. The third, the shortcomings of organized religion. This is another very common one. It's, as he says, common in these days, and especially among younger people, is the doubt engendered by visible hypocrisy and failure in institutional religion. Some select out doctrines or practices that seem regressive or repressive to intelligence. They see religion only a set of scruples designed to limit free exercise of thought. So hypocrisy, when you see scandals happening in churches, preachers who then commit gracious sins that they're speaking against. This is another reason that people begin to doubt the hypocrisy of the organized religion. Number 4, God in man's image. Now this is directly from, it goes back to pre-Socratic thought, but most recently in Voltaire, he says, it is said that man is made in the image of God, but God is made in the image of man. So this form of doubting comes from an individual who begins to see that religion and the concept of God is a man-created phenomenon. And it's another form of doubt. That's number 4. Number 5, the fifth style of doubt that he discusses is another egomorphic. Doubts associated with the genesis of the religious quest. We now come to a related mode of doubting that is of special interest to the psychologist. It takes its start from the facts reviewed in our first lecture, religious strivings, that were learned often originated in the desires of the body, in the pursuits of meaning beyond the range of intellectual capacity, and in the longing that values be conserved. Do we not then merely rationalize our yearnings with manufactured beliefs that are egomorphic, fashioned to satisfy a private desire or inner compulsion. What does this mean? This is when one views religion as merely a rationalization to fulfill one's own personal egocentric desires. There are so many examples of this. I'll give you one that's not in the book, but the very comment, the very idea that unsolicited advice is always self-serving. This is the quote by Alan Watts. So in other words, someone who evangelizes, this is going to be a criticism of religion from this point of view, of why people would doubt religion. Say someone who evangelizes, it's part of their belief that they're obligated to seek you out and spread the good news to you, teach you, introduce you to Jesus or to whatever religion it is. This is called evangelizing. It also happens through Richard Dawkins is a scientific evangelist. He evangelizes. He seeks people out and tries to sell them the scientific worldview, the atheistic worldview, I should say. That being said, from the point of view of the individual who is coming to you to introduce you to their religion, to save you, to save your soul, it is seen by them as an altruistic obligation that God has commanded them to do. From this position of belief, that is a rationalization for someone fulfilling some ego desire of their own, to have the power, the satisfaction of getting you to join on to their belief system. In social psychology, it would be social proof. So in other words, rationalization is when we have some personal desire, something gives us a sense of satisfaction or a feeling of power when we get someone else to join into our way of thinking. Isn't that, after all, what we do in college? The religion of secularization. I hope you get my humor that I inject here. And there's a reason that it's funny, because there's some grain of thoughtfulness in what we're laughing about. The rationalization. I once encountered someone who, a female who was working within a certain church, an evangelical church, and she was taught through classes in how to shepherd, how to evangelize, how to spread the word of their religion, to use whatever gifts God had given her to do so. And it turned out that this girl was very attractive, and she would use her attractiveness to have individuals, typically men, come into her life, and she would even flirt a bit. And once the man thought that she was interested in them, maybe for a relationship or something like this, she would then evangelize to them. She referred to this as using her vessel to preach. If you're not familiar with this concept, it might sound kind of shocking, but if you look into the practices of certain evangelical practices, you'll find that this is not unknown, using one's vessel. The body, that's the vessel that God has provided. So one has to question, the doubt here would be, is the individual using one's vessel to spread the word that they believe in, or is one getting a certain buzz and self-satisfaction out of the attention they're getting? In other words, does religion become their excuse to flirt and entertain taboo areas of life in their religious thought? So that would be an example of doubts associated with the genesis of the religious quest. In other words, what's your real intention? And the doubter looks at these hypocrisies and says, that's a rationalization. You're using your religious belief to justify and fulfill a self-serving desire. That's number 5. You read more about that in the text. Number 6 is our big one, scientific doubting. We come now to a more impressive mode of doubting, says Allport. one that arises out of the scientist's professional habits of thought. Doubting is one of his specialties. So he's telling us that built into the scientific way of thinking is doubt from the outset, a suspension of belief, an unwillingness to believe from the beginning. Nowadays, if you ask a concerning person what is religion, the reply may well be why he hasn't any religion. He's an intellectual. Although the majority of people are not scientists or intellectuals, so great is the prestige of science and so rapidly is its influence spreading through the universal education that scientific habits of thought are gradually extending themselves throughout the population as the whole. This is one of the examples I gave earlier of saying that I think we need to be careful to not become cynical, especially in Enlightenment thinking, in questioning, but remaining open to. The difference between skepticism and cynicism. Skepticism seems to me to be a healthful form of suspension of belief, whereas cynicism starts the conversation out with already the conclusion in hand, the doubt in hand. The scientific mode of thought, Allport says, is marked by deeply ingrained habits congruent with deeply ingrained sentiments. Foremost among these is the limitation of our interest imposed in the scientist's routine. Hour after hour, day after day, his attention is to held limited, accessible segments of nature, perhaps tensile strength of steel, the learning ability of the child, or the propensities of the carbon ring. His rewards come from his detailed discoveries, from riveting himself to the microcosm by excluding the macrocosm. So this is something you may have encountered. It seems like in the Enlightenment scientific worldview, the attention is on one small aspect rather than a big picture. This isn't true of all forms of psychology. Some psychology is big picture psychology, but there's a lot of psychology, especially when we're talking about biological psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience for sure, and behaviorism, that we're looking more at narrow specific instances rather than big picture context. I think it's important to keep in mind when you're reading these pages of the Gestalt psychologist who said that all the meaning comes from the context, from the big picture. That's what we study, the relationship of the particular with the detail within the context. It is easily understandable from the naturalistic point of view why human beings should have faith, for the religious urge reflects a primitive tendency possessing biological survival value to unify our environment so that we can cope with it. The religious sentiment is thus merely the culmination of a basic tendency of the organism to react in a configurational way to situations. But in itself, the configurational urge is guarantee of nothing objective. This is an example of what William James called nothing but psychology, dismissing a big overall picture as nothing but an evolutionary drive, a certain neurotransmitter or chemical motivation, a genetic cause. That's nothing but psychology. It's a criticism of that kind of psychology. Finally, the seventh, referential doubting. Just in time. I have left until the last the commonest mode of doubting, one that derives from science, but today is widely linked to common sense. It is the recurrent conflict between acceptable standards of evidence and this or that specific content of the religious teaching. How, with 20th century enlightenment, can one believe in the traditional statements regarding the fieriness of hell, the golden pavements of heaven, or the pillar of salt that Lot's wife, the resurrection of the body, the miracles, and all the rest of it? This mode of doubting, it will be noted, does not challenge the religious way of life nor the religious treatment of values, but only those statements which, if taken literally, would offend the ordinary canons of comprehension. To a modern mind searching for explicit reference, the sacred literature of all religions fares badly. Scriptures written once, 2 or 3,000 years ago are archaic and equivocal. Their explanations of natural phenomenon have long been in full retreat. This form of doubting throws the baby out with the bathwater, perhaps. For example, one rejects all of the religious view simply because it's irrational to think that a snake was talking in the Garden of Eden. The stories, the mythos, the myths, the narratives. One is dismisses all of religious belief based on the concept that all of the living creatures couldn't have possibly been on an ark, etc. The earth is much older than the 6,000 years old, as proposed in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. So you have literal interpretation. When one dismisses the religion out of hand simply because the stories are unfathomable, this is a form of doubt. And Allport, as you'll read more in depth, is critical of this. He says, be careful you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are certain things that the stories, even though they might not be real, pass on certain human truths. There's a message in the bottle, in other words. And just because the bottle might not be believable, the message in the bottle might be very useful in a big picture. So that is an outline in just over 40 minutes of your chapter. And now next we'll go to the final chapter of this book and wrap up our discussion of Gordon Allport's Humanistic Psychology of Religion.